Our first session of the morning, though, is one that I am particularly excited about. I've grown to know our first guest speaker, Matt Rogan, over the last number of years through not only his work, but also more lately of a book he has written, which is more or less a playbook on how we're going to emerge from the last 2 years. He has been an inspiration to me and to many others. You'll be familiar with his voice from a variety of podcasts, with his words from the book itself as well. And Matt has joined us from London, flying in last night as well to be here with us today and to be here with you. There are over 400 of you that have registered to join us this morning from 18 countries across the world. So a very warm welcome to you and a very warm welcome to our first speaker, Matt Rogan. Matt, you're very welcome to Sport for Business, Sport for Social Good. Tell me, in the introduction to your book, All to Play For, you spoke of London 2012 as being a watershed moment where sport could really begin to make things happen. What have you seen over the last 10 years, before we get to the last 2 years, that has actually given rise to that in your mind, that those words have come true?
Well, thank you for having me, firstly. I guess I remember the Olympics in 2012 for all sorts of things. One of them may be the fact that actually people on the underground in London would say hello to you and offer you a seat, and just sort of broader social, I guess, just goodwill that was flying around London at the time of the games and more broadly. And actually, the truth is, I think, in the few years after 2012, so as we went to the 2010s, actually things weren't necessarily immediately that promising. So Britain and wider pieces across Europe, including here, we're in a period of real austerity. Times were pretty tough. Of course, the Brexit thing happened as well in Britain in 2016. But actually, 17, 18, 19, there was starting to be some really interesting signs for me as I looked across the sort of sporting landscape. The things I was seeing, I was thinking, hang on, we're at a bit of a tipping point here. So, for example, I'm proud to support and work with a charity called Stormbreak that does activity for kids in schools. Uses exercise in schools in different ways. And they'd started to run some pilot studies on the south of England, and they'd started to show that actually, if you're active through the course of a school curriculum during a day, kids learn more effectively. That's not just about PE, but kids were active, learned more effectively. And what that meant is their results were better, and the teachers were happier and more enjoyed teaching them. Similar way, Parkrun in the UK had started to experiment with working with doctors' surgeries to say, well, rather than prescribe medication for early onset diabetes, what we're going to do is try and get people to get out and be active instead, and get some stellar results from some of those pilots. Just early stage stuff, pilots in both cases. We were also starting to see in the UK some really interesting things where the role of the professional footballer was changing from something that was traditionally professional footballers was sort of seen as the nada of British society in a lot of ways. Loads of money, didn't care, didn't really have any social conscience. People like Raheem Sterling were stepping into a place of just starting to challenge the way in which they were perceived, and starting to say some really very intelligent things around race, for example. And so there's lots of little fires burning. And I was really excited by those as we turned into the 2020s. And then, of course, as you say, things changed a little bit.
It did indeed. We were fortunate enough, the first Sport for Social Good event that we did, we had the Manchester United Foundation came over and spoke about what the work that they were doing. And that was before Marcus Rashford and those kind of good things that came out from between COVID. But these last 2 years, they really have positioned us in a completely different place than we imagined ourselves to be as a society. And the importance that sport has in terms of our own identity, in terms of how we see ourselves and how we live our lives, was put on hold completely.
Yeah.
And yet it re-emerged. It came back to the fore. Last year, we spoke to SuperValue and the GAA about the powerful community program that they actually brought into place. What have you seen in that 2 years that has copper fastened that ability of sport to be a permission-based thing to do good?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? When Seb Coe actually pitched for London 2012 games. He used a phrase that really stuck with me, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think that really rings true in the context of where we stand today at the end of the last 2 years. My first reflection probably on that period of 2 years was you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that's true whether you're used to putting on a coloured shirt, the same coloured shirt as another 10 people, and going out to play a game on a Saturday afternoon. That is true whether you actually just like going to watch a team sport, going to watch a competitive event as a spectator. When sport was taken off our screens, I think we realised maybe some of the impact that that it has in our lives more broadly than just entertainment, a sense of kind of coherence and community. That's the first thing. The second thing I think is actually that what COVID has done over the last 2 years has really created some pretty deep financial holes. We thought our financial holes were deep before we started, and clearly they're a lot starker now. And in particular, what we noticed from a sporting perspective is actually that some of those perhaps from the more affluent walks of life have been okay. So if you have a slightly larger house, it's not a problem to order a treadmill or order some weights and be able to do something in your back room. That's not true if you live in a tower block, maybe where it's not necessarily that safe to go out for a run when you come home from work at 6 and 7 o'clock at night. And so the second thing that's happened is that it's sort of pushed the social divide that exists in sport more starkly. Second thing. And the third thing that's happened is, as I mentioned, sort of a broad debt in the context of, in the book, we called it the toxic alphabet that we've been through right now. And COVID is part of sadly, of a journey we've been through in the last sort of decade or so of austerity, Brexit, COVID, debt as a result, and my son's generation looking at the environment as well, if you want an E. And so against that backdrop, against that debt, but also recognizing what sport's given us through that journey, it felt the right time to press the button and write the book because the time really is now. And just before COVID, there were those petri dish signs that things were changing. And through the course of writing the book, where we speak to 30 people around the world of sport who are doing some really interesting, very different things that I think are going to change the way in which we're able to use it as a source for social good.
It is a fascinating book. It's been on my bedside locker and on my desk throughout since you published it in COVID. And it's a playbook. It's a toolkit on how we can begin to emerge, because we are a little bit like children, that we're having to learn to walk again. We're having to learn to re-engage with our fellow humans. Even an event like this today, which we've been running over the last 2 years in little boxes on the screen. Yeah. Okay, so we're still in a little box on your screen, but we're here in person talking about it. So we've actually got an in-person event later on this afternoon, and we've got a copy of the book for everybody who can join us for that. More on that a little bit later. But the book is fascinating all the way through, and then at the end. And that's what I want to focus on in our conversation today. You come to a number of forecasts as to how that can work. Sport is a universal language. It's one that can actually, deliver to people the messages that we need to actually get back into the world. The first of those things, though, is a kind of a counterintuitive one. You want to reimagine sport as play. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I guess probably the best way that I could explain that is, if I take myself back to the mid-90s at university, in the bar at university, I'd be sat around with 3 or 4 friends most evenings, and one of our big favourite topics was, do you think darts is a sport? Do you think snooker's a sport? And what I mean by that is, it tells you a couple of things. Firstly, we're probably quite a bit snobby about what sport might be. It had to have, in our world, it had to have a ball, and maybe perhaps and to have a cardiovascular component to it. But also it tells you something that's to be a sport was a bit of a badge of honor. If you were a sport, then that was sort of legitimate. And if you were just playing around or messing around with something, maybe that in our eyes, that didn't carry the same amount of cachet and wasn't valid. And I think what we've seen in particular, because of the generational tipping point we're at, we've seen that change completely. So if I said to my 15-year-old son, You think playing Fortnite, is that a sport? Or going out and drawing a diagram on Strava of where you've run to try and draw a picture, you know, is that sport? He would look at me like I crawled out from under a rock. Just because, not because he doesn't like his old man, hopefully, but because it's just a mute question. So in this world in which newer generations are growing up, where they can, you know, I grew up when I could watch 3 or 4 sports through a day if I was lucky on television. He can consume 40 before breakfast on his phone. And so it's a real much more eclectic melting pot now of, he would view playing FIFA on an Xbox, Fortnite on the computer, going out into cricket nets and working on his forward defensive with exactly the same frame as reference. It's playing and it's enjoyment. Sometimes that's competitive and sometimes it's not. But it really challenges our older generation perception that, you know, a cricket over must have 6 balls in it. Like, we just need to get over ourselves and I guess encompass a more wide-ranging view of what it is to engage in exercise. It's playing.
The sporting infrastructure is uber traditional, which is ironic given the fact that it's only 150 years old, really, since we actually got into this position. But my own definition of what could be classed as a sport was always based on if it requires an element of skill and if there's an element of competition. That could be against your previous self, or it could be against a physical opponent. And I think that is definitely moving in that direction. One of the other areas that you speak about, and it's, again, there's a kind of an irony in that we're in a FIFA World Cup year whereby the world is going to be watching one particular massive global sporting event, and yet you focused on the fact that sport needs to become more local in order to become more powerful.
Yeah, and of course it's ironic. And I spent 10 years of my career helping the likes of Manchester United or Liverpool or Chelsea or whoever it might be, global audiences, global fan bases. And yet the reality is none of those organizations carry any validity as a broadcast tool, or as a potential sponsory rights holder, unless there is a strong domestic infrastructure. And you know, the COP is nothing at Liverpool unless it's full. And we talked through the course of the book to a lot of clubs and teams doing things very differently. I agree, Bohemian doing some really interesting stuff, and I won't spoil that for later on. We talked to Tranmere Rovers, sort of the 3rd club in Liverpool, behind Liverpool and Everton in terms of overall scale. And they've said, look, we have to make ends meet here. We have to create some viable businesses, and we're in a really impoverished area of this city. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider our venue a 24/7 venue, and we're going to launch mental health programs. Because we recognise in this area that it's a lot easier to get a lady or man between the ages of 16 to 34 to turn up for a kick around, a coffee and a conversation with other people going through the same kind of things than it is to take them into a blue clinic that nobody really wants to go into in the evenings. And we're going to demonstrate that works. And we're going to charge our health service in the UK for that. And we're going to create a viable business around that. And by doing things like that, by creating little pop-up shops during the course of the days, by climbing walls on the side of their stands, all sorts of things, trying to create a sense of validity and currency to the strange building that's in the middle of a really challenged area of the city, and become a more coherent part of the community. Where I live, our cricket club actually has seized an opportunity, because one of the things that happened in England was that a lot of our pubs shut and haven't reopened. And so they've said, well, hang on, we've got a bar, we've got a lot of open space, which is needed in COVID times. Why don't we open for a couple of days a week, but why don't we invite people to bring their kids down and we'll run some programs for them? Just again, to re-recognizing that role in the heart of the local community. And I think that's so pivotal at the moment. Because our town centres need to completely reinvent the way in which they work. You know, when I went to London after university, I wanted somewhere that was had physical shops, was close to where I worked, and had a lot of bars. and I look at my son, think about my daughter, and think about, well, what's their world going to look like when they leave school or when they leave college? They would feel like they can work anywhere, don't need to be close to the office. They buy all their shopping online. And they do other things with their spare time than live in pubs. Or at least I hope they do. So you put those 3 things together and you say, okay, well, how do we make exercise, just like Tranmere Rovers, whether it's an affluent area or an impoverished area, how do we make our towns and clubs the heartbeat of cities? Because something's going to need to pull younger generations to live in the centre of them.
We do want to become a part of our local so that our team is important. But sport is very tribal, so that can cause issues as well. If you're in Glasgow, it depends on whether you're wearing a green or a blue jersey. That defines you, it badges you in some ways, and it can be difficult to get across that. Whereas if you're supporting Scotland, for example, then you're coming together. You mentioned about the validity that a big event actually needs to gain from the smaller local stuff. But is that the case in an event like the FIFA World Cup, where billions of us will be tuning in for this one event? Maybe half of them would have no interest in a local club or in a local sporting context, but they still tune in for that. So is this, is the gap, or is there a bridgeable gap between the local and the big?
I think it will polarize, actually, is what I think we'll see in the next few years. So I think we'll see the big get bigger and the smaller have to redefine their relationship with their local communities. So yes, of course, the FIFA World Cup will continue to have that sort of universal appeal. I think in the States this year, I think 96 of the top 100 broadcasts were sport, right? So at that top mainstream level, sport will continue to coalesce eyeballs. I would challenge whether the next generations coming through will want a World Cup any more than every 4 years, because they're far more aware of climate change and the challenges that come with that. And I think international competitions will need to change. I think we'll see things like the Euros football, for example, or even perhaps Six Nations happening in tighter windows in one location, just to offset some of the challenges with climate. They will continue to exist, but I think if you want to have a sustainable club, we'll probably hear it from Bohemian later, and you want to have a sustainable club with a sustainable operation, you have to be hardwired to your local community.
The sort of the context of polarization, and you mentioned at the start about how the Premier League in England was a kind of a poster opportunity almost for the wildest of excesses. Players like Messi, Ronaldo, Salah, they're earning more in the space of 2 days than most of us would ever enjoy in earning in a year or more, and yet those athletes are kind of central to the ability of young people to engage with it.
Yeah.
So, people identify in Formula One, they don't identify as kids with the mechanics of the engine. They identify with Lando Norris or with Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen or whoever that might be. But the athletes themselves, it seems as though their positioning has changed over the course of the last 2 years. Is that something that we should be cynical about, that actually they are still well divorced from what the real world is? Or is there a genuine sense that they have a powerful platform and they really feel as though they need to use that?
I think it's a generational thing, and they are aware of the platform and more able and capable of using it. I think part of that is because they've been trained to communicate through direct social channels for the course of the last 5 years. They've grown up with the need to express a view on digitally and otherwise. I think part of that is the support of organisations, actually a little bit like Rock Nation, who's Marcus Rashford's agent, who kind of help them take their views and make them real. I think part of that's what's going on in society as well. So I'm a big fan, actually, of a piece of work by a comms agency called Adelman. They do a thing called the Trust Index every year, and they interview tens of thousands of people, North America and right the way across Europe, to look at whether we trust organizations or things. And they say that trusting someone or something is you have to believe they're ethical, share the same ethical view as you, and you have to believe they're competent. And if you look at the last 3 years of research, in general in Western Europe, in Ireland and in the UK, we do not believe any of corporates, government, media or NGOs are ethical and competent. So on general, collectively, we don't trust them. We don't believe NGOs are competent, even though we think they're really ethical. We don't believe corporates are ethical, even though we think they're pretty competent at what they do. And most worryingly, we don't believe government or media are either competent or ethical. So in that context, when I see my kids looking for someone to listen to, put their trust in, they've got so many teachers they can listen to. That's where you see the likes of Rashford and Stormzy from a musical perspective actually sharing views and those being well received. when Billie Jean King and Muhammad Ali and things were making exactly the same kind of statements 30, 40 years ago, the truth is the government could offset them and squash them pretty easily, because trust in government was about 80%. Right now it's 30%, which is why you see the sports people filling that vacuum. Our responsibility, I think, as an industry is to get around those athletes and help them understand, firstly, that they still are only 22. Their forms of views are still forming. I wouldn't have done that in an eloquent way, age 22. And secondly, recognise that they're primarily viewed as competent because of their performance on the pitch, and that has to come first. But they have a really important role to play in the next 10 years of our society, I believe.
Here's us two slightly past the first flush of youth, white guys sitting on a stage in Dublin, making Stormzy references. But one of his lines was, "Heavy lies the head that wears the crown." I think you might have got it from some older white guy as well in the past. But that responsibility that we're putting on players and athletes, as a generic type, they're young, they are totally self-obsessed and focused on their own performance, and yet now we're moving them into a position whereby they have the right and the permission, and indeed sometimes the obligation, to make statements on public policy that might otherwise have been well beyond their area of comfort. You mentioned about the industry actually needing to work with them to create that. Is that an environment which is yet to be worked out? Because the more we coach somebody, the less genuine they might sometimes appear.
I think the job of, I'm no player agent. I think the job of the player agent and the player manager is actually to help them work out what are the one or two issues that are really important to them. Why is Raheem Sterling good at doing what he's doing? Why is Marcus Rashford very credible in that space as well? It's because they're taught from personal experience about things that have been close to their world. And so Stormzy actually the same. And so I would argue Anthony Joshua the same, Megan Rapinoe the same. And I would argue that our responsibility is help athletes deflect things that don't fit in their area of competence. When was, or understanding, when was the last time you heard a politician talk about an area that's outside of their core portfolio? Like, never. And so why would we expect our professional athletes to be any different? They talk about the area that they can talk about with knowledge and empathy and care, and otherwise be very comfortable at saying, well, it's not an area I know in any detail. Most of my focus is on the pitch, but I know this is important.
Okay, and they've stepped up. The players that you've mentioned there, so many of them that have come to bear, and that has an impact on the sporting body that sometimes needs to step away a little bit as well. And we saw it with Naomi Osaka and all sorts of different things. One of the areas, and just in case you're watching and you've got a question that's burning a hole on your keyboard, please do pop it into the chat, and we'll try and get to some of those before we finish up this session. Technology is all around us. It's an obvious enabler. The technology companies are getting closer and closer to sport as well. Whoop have got a partnership with the Irish Rugby Players Association here, and various others as well. And they were able to detect COVID and flag COVID from our bodily signals well before we had any symptoms or anything like that. In Germany now, there's legislation which allows for the German equivalent of a general practitioner to actually, write a prescription for a tracker band. So they're in that space. Is technology, which is often seen as being in some way dehumanizing, is it going to be a continuing force for good in that sense?
I believe so. Actually, when I stepped back from the business that I grew and ran for the best part of 10 years, I went through a sort of a mass version of what we go when we get to Christmas. We all sort of collapse and, finally made it. And then we get sick, then we get cold. And I went through a bit of a version of that on a mass scale, and my immunity basically completely disappeared. I had a couple of bouts of skin cancer, and so I had to work quite hard on building my own health back. And I've used something broadly the same as a Whoop band, like a ring that measures things for me, like my core body temperature and my immunity levels, through heart rate variability, this kind of stuff. And what I noticed for that is it's anything other than dehumanizing, because it helps me understand my health as me. So I know now whether I'm exhausted from work the day before, whether it makes sense for me to go for a run, and I won't make myself get a cold as a result. Little things like that. And this, when I bought it, I think it was about 250 euros, and the cost is collapsing for this kind of tech, which is why in Germany they can afford to prescribe bans and things like that, as opposed to courses of drugs. It's ultimately more effective for them. I think they, in England, did a piece of research and discovered that if you spend £1 on activity as a source of health, you save the state £4 in terms of costs to hospitals, drugs, stuff like that. So it pays back. And that's why the context we are now of debt and changing things differently is so important, because it's our crisis. We can't let go to waste, and we have to embrace some of that more bespoke type healthcare. Actually, when I was working out my immunity, I found out through some blood tests I was pre-diabetic, which is very annoying, somebody who loves his ice cream. And so as a result, again, about every 3 months, I'd sort of take a live blood sugar test just to sort of see where I'm at. And again, that's not dehumanizing. That helps me understand, for me, which foods are going to help me stay healthy, which foods actually are suggested to drive diabetes but don't really seem to impact me, and which foods are definitely no-nos. So for me, the ice cream is the no-nos, but I can get away with plain chocolate. So that's not dehumanizing. That puts the power in my hands. And that's why I think from an exercise perspective, we're a really interesting place, because as the cost of that kind of thing declines, we can start to say, actually, let's really embrace exercise as by far the most cost-effective means of healthcare.
Education is power, and one-to-one is the most powerful of all. That sort of sense of technology being used within sport, because healthcare is obviously an industry which is, a multiple of almost infinitely larger than what the sports industry is about. But we're kind of like the space race, so that physiology and the pursuit of human perfection in a sporting environment is going to give lessons which will be applicable to all of the rest of us as well. So that's an important one. Education and children, and looping back to to our first conversation about sport as play. You also mentioned the fact that children have to be allowed to actually play. Yeah. That the competitive urge which we have as parents needs to be put on the back burner, and you're a great advocate of silent parenting when it comes to the sports field.
It's a really interesting one, actually. So I talked to there was a period in the UK where we could take our kids back to play competitive sport in teams, but we weren't allowed to watch as parents. And I talked to 3 or 4 coaches from different sports that my kids play just afterwards, kind of, well, what was that like for you? How was it? Was it really quiet and eerie on the line? Could you hear yourself talk? And they said to a man and woman, they said, that's the most rewarding coaching I've ever done. I said, well, why? There was nobody there. Like, didn't care about the result. And said, well, kids smiled more. Kids took more risks. There was none of a kid making a mistake, looking furtively right or left at their cross parent on the side. The kids listened to each other on the pitch, because there weren't 10,000 wannabe Jose Mourinho's shouting random uninformed advice from the sides. And they said, as a result, they learned and they wanted to come back the next week. Actually, sadly, in the UK, what we found is post-COVID, parents are worse behaved coming back to matches. And there's a couple of netball leagues have kicked off, actually, in just outside London, with saying, okay, we're changing our rules. Like, this is a behind closed doors league, so your kids are very welcome to play, but we're not allowing parents in to watch. And we understand that it's a purely female sport in the UK. Various girls will not want to come back because you won't want them to come back, but we can guarantee the girls that come to play in our leagues will love it.
It's fascinating. It does, again, it kind of turns things on its head. as opposed to, you know, when we got involved in sport, but it is so much the better. I suppose if there was a petri dish for that as well, you could almost see it in the, you know, in the professional football and rugby and sport that was happening behind closed doors, where I'm convinced that the quality of passing that players were actually able to execute was so much higher, and the quality of thought, because they weren't having to look over their shoulder or listen to that incessant, you know, chatter about, oh God, not him again, that they were willing to take things on.
And they could hear the person next to them say, over there, back here, come around the corner. Like, you could talk to each other. It's how you play well as a team, right?
It is fascinating. The last one that you sort of look at in terms of that is going back to the big picture of professional sport and the, you know, the ability of professional sport to guide sport and play and everything else. And you've said that professional sport is going to need to become more professional. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this has proved one of the more controversial ones in the sports industry specifically. But what I mean by that is that in everything we do as an industry, we can take a broader perspective of the opportunity that sport has and start to think about our own responsibilities, firstly in terms of diversity, so to hire people across our organizations that represent the audiences we're trying to target. You know, we were poor at that, I would say, in the agency that we built in 2 circles. We tried, but we didn't try hard enough. That's the first thing. The second thing is having to finally get our heads around the fact that the governance and the way in which we run our teams and leagues needs to be more appropriate for a 21st century society that will be more challenging. That's true whether you're FIFA, that's true whether you're a football team. There's a lot of governance reviews going on in the UK right now, so supporters having golden shares of club, some of those kind of things. And I think that's an inevitability, actually, because we carry such potency in those organizations we run because of the fanship and the followership we create, and that comes with more of the responsibility than the pure balance sheet. And the final thing I think is that sport traditionally has been created for white middle class males, and the way in which the rules are set up, the games are played, the prices that are charged, and so on, the places the teams play, it's all predicated around that. And part of loosening up around playing is saying, well, actually, cricket overs do not need to be 6 overs, six balls, you know, and the furore that happens when you try and change that, you know, those kind of things are the fact that you might have the women's match at something like the 100 playing the pinnacle evening slot, and the men's match, you know, earlier on in the day, you know, just having to challenge some preconceptions around the way things have been done. And that's hard, and change is always hard. But as a professional sports industry, we carry an opportunity in terms of our social impact, but also a responsibility as a result.
Change happens slowly and then all in a rush.
Absolutely.
Overnight. We wake up one morning and things are different. Where Sport for Business is a kind of a media and networking organization in between those big sporting organizations and those big corporate businesses. So I often feel sometimes as though I'm dancing on a very small pinhead, and you've confirmed that we need to do an awful lot more. We need to, in order to actually fulfill the true potential of sport as a human activity and to encourage play, we need to continually work harder each day. You've given us plenty of food for thought. We could talk for the rest of the day. We will gather again in person later on this afternoon. But for the time being, Matt Rogan, thank you very much for coming over. And we're going to just go now to a small little piece of Ireland. The Gaelic Athletic Association is our biggest sporting organisation and our biggest community organisation. And in the last 2 years, they produced a piece of content entitled "Where We All Belong," and I think it speaks to quite a bit of what we've just been talking about.
We all need somewhere. We who live for the day that might never come. We who go back again and again to where we come from.
Well, lads, what's the crack?
We who won't stop until we're unstoppable. We who will never say no to getting stuck in.
You got it all free?
We who pass on every tradition and skill that was passed on to us. We who love the days that come forever. Him, her, them, us. We all need somewhere that belongs to us all. GAA, where we all belong.